Okay, and this is our energy from the sun activity. The materials needed for students is a piece of paper and something to write and draw with. And as a teacher, you also need something to write or draw with, preferably up on a whiteboard where the students can see what you're doing and kind of follow along. Or you can also do this on a piece of paper as well. So this is the way that your students are going to set up their paper. They're going to draw a line down the center horizontally. And on the top half, they're going to write sources on the side. And on the bottom half, they're going to write uses. So this activity is to get kids thinking about the different energy sources that we use and how we use them as humans. And so you can frame this conversation in many different ways depending on your age range and their background knowledge, right? So you can start by asking students what are ways in which we use energy, and they may say things like turning on a light, powering appliances, driving a car, right? So that's going to lead us to our three main uses of energy, which is transportation, heat, and electricity. So they're going to write this down, and you're going to write this down on the board. And then the top half, we're going to be drawing out our energy sources. Again, you will draw, and the students will kind of follow along. So again, you can frame this conversation in many different ways. One way you can start the conversation is by asking where most of our energy derives from. And if they know the name of this activity, they're going to be able to tell you that most of our energy derives from the sun. And again, you're going to ask some questions like, okay, can you name an energy source? If you start with the sun, most of your students will probably start with, well, we can get energy from the sun using solar panels, right? And that's true. We can harness that sun's energy by converting the photons of energy that get absorbed by the solar panel into electricity. You can also create heat with solar. This is called solar thermal, which is a little bit different. But those are the ways in which we can use solar energy, which is a renewable resource. A second source of energy is wind. And you can ask your students how we harness the energy in the wind, and we do that with wind turbines, right? And how is the wind connected to the sun? Well, the sun heats the earth unevenly, and that difference in temperature allows warm air to rise, cold air to move in, and that moving air causes wind. We can harness that wind with wind turbines, and with wind turbines, we can generate electricity. Another energy source is hydro or water. Again, the water cycle is driven by the sun, so that source of energy also derives from the sun, right? The sun is what causes precipitation and evaporation and condensation, which creates our moving water sources on Earth. We can harness that energy in water to create electricity. And we do that by generally building a dam, right? Now, this is a pretty complicated picture, so I don't expect the teacher to draw this on the board or for the students to draw this, but this is a good time to talk about the use of turbines and generators to generate electricity. So besides solar panels, every other energy source that we're using to create electricity, whether it's renewable or non-renewable, we are generally converting kinetic energy in that energy source to mechanical energy using a turbine which spins. That turbine is connected to an electrical generator, and that is the device that creates electricity that we use, right? So in all these cases, except for solar panels, that is how we are generating electricity. Another energy source that your students might not think of right away is, this is called biomass. So you may ask, well, how do we survive? Do we need energy to live? And of course we do. We need to eat, right? So we can eat plants. We can also eat animals. The animals can also eat the plants in order to survive. And of course, those plants are surviving via the process of photosynthesis, which happens because of the sun, right? And so we can actually use this energy source in a lot of different ways. The most direct way that your students probably will think of, again, is for food, so that we can have the energy to do things. But we can also generate heat with this energy source by burning it directly, like for firewood. We can produce electricity by burning wood pellets, or we can, here in Anchorage, we have at our landfill, we capture the methane that comes off of the landfill from the tiny organisms that break down our trash, and we burn that methane to generate both electricity and heat. So in that case, we're using steam to turn a turbine. We can also use this energy source for transportation because there's such a thing as biofuels, which is a mixture of our regular fuel source plus something like vegetable oil or animal fat or something like that. So this source collectively is called biomass. Another energy source, our non-renewables now, are natural gas and oil. So again, you can ask your students, well, how are these sources connected to the sun? And for that, we have to think about how they were formed. So millions of years ago, there were tiny sea plants and animals that lived in the ocean. These plants and animals eventually died. They got buried, and then over millions of years of time and pressure, they formed what we now know as our fossil fuels, natural gas and oil. So then we can extract that natural gas and oil, and we can use it to create electricity, again, by burning it to create steam to turn a turbine. We can burn it directly for heat or for cooking. So in Anchorage, we're mostly using natural gas for our heating source for our houses. And finally, of course, we can use it for transportation, right? Most of us use petroleum or diesel to fuel our cars so we can move around. The other non-renewable resource here is fossil fuel is coal. Coal is pretty similar to the other two. It forms a little bit differently though. Again, plants that lived many years ago, millions of years ago in swamps that survived because of photosynthesis, died and got buried under that swamp, created a material called peat. That peat eventually turned into coal, which is what we extract and mine for. And you can use coal, again, to produce electricity by burning it. We can burn it directly or heat. Okay. Now, another source that is actually renewable, but that students might not think of, is geothermal. Geothermal is a little different than the other sources in that the energy actually does not derive from the sun. It derives from the heat coming from the Earth's core. And students will often think of geysers and volcanoes, right? But we can actually, again, harness that energy, harness that heat, use it directly to heat our spaces. Or again, we can have a power plant that takes that steam and turns a turbine and creates electricity. And if you're familiar with Chena Hot Springs, they have a geothermal power plant up there. Okay, once you go through that activity, again, it could be as in-depth or basic as you need it to be depending on your student's background. You can then take that knowledge and make it into a game. So this is called our energy chains game. You see all these words here relate pretty directly to what we just went over. You can print these words out. We have them available for PDF so that you can make copies and give them to each group of students. And the idea is that you give students an end use of energy, and they have to create a chain, an energy chain, with as many steps as possible, usually starting with the sun, all the way to how you get to that end use of energy. So we'll go through a quick example here. If I said, okay, your example of using energy is turning on a light. Well, as a student, you could say, okay, well, most of our energy derives from the sun. That sun allowed small sea plants and animals to grow millions of years ago. Those animals and plants eventually died and formed our fossil fuels, oil and natural gas, and we can extract and burn those things to create electricity. Now that chain would get you 5 points because there's 5 steps, but students will learn pretty quickly that they can make their chains a little bit more complicated if they think a little bit about it. So you could say, well, I live in Anchorage and we have a wind farm here, so the sun also heats the earth unevenly, which creates wind, which we can harness for electricity. That whole chain would be worth 7 points. You can go even more in depth and say, okay, well, the sun actually also allows berry roots and leaves to grow via photosynthesis. Caribou, fish, and moose all eat those things to survive. Humans eat all of those things also to survive. And then it's humans who harness and create power plants to create electricity, and it's humans who turn on the lights. So that whole chain would be worth 10 points. So the idea is that you can split your students into groups. You can give them examples of an end use of energy, and their goal is to make the longest chain to get them the most amount of points.